How's it going, gents? Stand in the Door 1944. Today we're going to be doing a little bit of a different video because today is February 16th, 2024, and that marks the second anniversary of the passing away of Dan McBride, Fox Company 502nd PIR, the 101st Airborne. My relationship with Dan is probably the closest I'd had with any World War II vet, with the exception of possibly my two grandfathers. So whenever I got the call that he had passed away, it was exceptionally difficult. I had a lot of memories wrapped up with Dan McBride. I first met Dan at the World War II Airborne Demonstration Team. Dan was a huge supporter of the ADT. He lived in Silver City, New Mexico, which is about an 8 or 10 hour drive, if I remember, from Silver City to Lawton, Oklahoma, where the ADT is based. And he would come up there almost every jump school, and he would spend at least 6 or 7 days with us. And those days were always chock full of amazing stories. If there was something I could say that kind of summarized Dan McBride, was that guy was an iron trap. He remembered everything. He remembered dates, he remembered people's names, he remembered what gear he wore, he remembered everything. So he was an absolute wealth of knowledge for people who were interested in studying the 101st Airborne and paratroopers in World War II. So whenever he would come to the ADT, he would spend hour after hour with not only the members, the current members of the team, but also the new incoming students. So as students would finish up their training day and they'd be getting chow, they would have the opportunity to speak with Dan, and they'd be able to hear his stories as well to kind of get even more motivation for what was coming up later that week, being their jumps. So Dan McBride was just such an integral part of the ADT experience. And since his passing, myself and all the other members really miss him. We miss his company, we miss his humor. That guy had more jokes than you could possibly know what to do with. And so I kind of wanted to take a minute and kind of go into one of my favorite stories about Dan, and one of my favorite artifacts that he brought back that was such an integral part of his life as well. So whenever I first met Dan, he had just driven up to the ADT, and as he did, I immediately recognized him as a World War II vet, so I walked up to him to see what I could be doing to be of assistance to him, and as soon as I walked up, he says, "I'm Dan McBride. You want to see my 1911? And I'm kind of taken aback, but I'm like, I'm a big gun guy, so I'm like, heck yeah, I want to see your 1911. And so he walks over to the back of his car and he pops the trunk, and I expect him to pull out, some newer model 1911 that he's a big fan of and so forth, but he didn't. Instead, he pulled out an old original 1911 like this, and he told me the story about how he got it, and it was one of my favorite stories that Dan ever told, and so I want to share that with you today. So whenever Dan landed on D-Day, he had a pretty eventful landing. He ended up landing with his feet tied up in his risers and his suspension line, so he actually landed upside down, and he was knocked unconscious whenever he hit the ground. But that's a story for another time. I'll kind of fast forward through that. But we don't know exactly where Dan was dropped. We do know approximately because the first identifiable terrain feature that he ran into was a blacktop road. And we know exactly where that blacktop road is with help from Mark Bando. He was actually over with Dan, and they drove around for hours trying to find this particular road, and sure enough, they ran into it. And whenever Dan jumped, he was originally supposed to have an 03 Springfield, but jumping with an 03 Springfield is very difficult because you can't break it down and put it into a Griswold bag like the M1. So he had his 03 Springfield with a rifle grenade attachment, and it was in a bundle underneath the plane. And he was the third guy in the stick, and so he was supposed to release the bundle, and as soon as he'd land, he'd be able to secure his weapon. But he wanted to be able to jump with a weapon. He didn't want to jump without any weapon, obviously. So he jumped with a folding stock M1 Carbine like this, and Dan absolutely hated this gun. He thought that the M1 Carbine was the most worthless firearm to ever be invented because of its lack of stopping power, and so he was wanting to get rid of this as soon as possible. But sure enough, he couldn't find that drop bundle that was under the plane, and so he starts hunting off, and he's trying to find other GIs to run into. And so as he's walking, he's by himself for about 2 or 3 hours, maybe a little bit more. He said it was right around 4 o'clock in the morning, all of a sudden he starts getting shot at by an automatic weapon. And he said that it was too slow to be a Tommy gun, and he said it was too fast to be a light machine gun. So he knew that it had to be a German. And so he got up on the other side of a hedgerow from this German, and he threw over a grenade, and he ran up on top of the hedgerow and unloaded a whole magazine from his M1 Carbine into that German. And what the German had was a STG44. Dan would refer to this as the Buck Rogers gun, given its futuristic look. And so Dan picked this up, and he took his M1 Carbine first, and he grabbed it by the barrel, and he smashed it against a tree, and then he threw it in a ditch so that nobody else could use it. A German couldn't pick it up. And so he picked up this guy. But kind of a surprising thing for Dan, Dan's a real gun guy, and the first thing that he did or didn't do was to drop the magazine out of this and see how many rounds were left in the magazine, and or pick up more ammunition from the German. He was probably pretty shooken up from killing that first German and just being by himself there in Normandy. So he just picked up the gun and went. And shortly thereafter, he ran into one of his buddies. And shortly after that is whenever they got onto that blacktop road, and they ran into 3 members of the 82nd Airborne. And so they're on that road, and the 82nd Airborne lieutenant's trying to figure out where they are. And Dan turns to the lieutenant, and he says, "Lieutenant, you know where we are?" And the lieutenant's looking at his map, and he's like, "You know, from what I can tell, looking at these maps, I'm pretty sure we're in Europe." So they had no idea where they were. And so as they're camped out on this road, all of a sudden Dan starts seeing a 36 Ford driving down the road in camouflage paint. And they didn't know if it was a French resistance car, or they didn't know that it was a German car, so they kind of held fire for a minute. And whenever the car came within about 30 yards of their position, one of the troopers that Dan was with could recognize that the German driving it was wearing a German helmet. And so he shot and killed the driver, and the car ran off into a ditch. And then a German got out of the back of the car, and he was fiddling with something on his belt. And that's when Dan opened up with the Sturmgewehr, and he fired 4 rounds. He said they fired very quickly, and because they were at such close range, all 4 rounds hit the German. And then the gun ran dry. He only had 4 rounds in the magazine, and he didn't have any other ammunition with him. So he had to get rid of this gun. So that's his second weapon in Normandy that he had to get rid of just within a few hours. So after Dan kills that German, he walks up to the car, up to the German that he had killed, and he had a belt on with a leather holster like this. And so he takes the belt off, and he puts it around his waist with the holster, and they jump in that car, and they actually drive it a couple miles back up the road where the German had come from. So I'm not sure if it was later that morning or later that day, but Dan runs into a glider pilot. Dan's taking cover in a ditch, and a glider pilot comes walking up this road, and Dan turns to the glider pilot, and he calls, "Hey, you better get down or you're going to get shot." And so the glider pilot jumps in with him, and the glider pilot looks down at Dan and sees that he's got this German leather belt on and a holster. And he's like, "Hey, what kind of pistol you got there?" And Dan's like, "I don't know, I haven't even checked." So he opens up the leather holster and opens it up, and sure enough, there's the famous German Lugar inside. And as soon as the glider pilot saw that, his eyes got about the size of golf balls, and he says, I'll pay you for that Lugar." And Dan's like, "I'm in France. What the heck am I going to do with any money?" And the glider pilot's like, "Oh, what about a trade?" And Dan's like, "I don't know. What do you have?" And he's like, "Oh, well, I've got this 1911. And Dan's like, "Done and done." So Dan was more excited about having a 1911 as opposed to a Lugar, because he knew it was going to be easier to get magazines and ammunition for the 1911. So I'm not sure if it was later that same day that Dan got the pistol, or if it was a couple days later, or what made him look at the serial number. But the serial number on this is what really caught his attention. Of course, he was glad to have a sidearm, but whenever he looked at that serial number, it really popped out at him, because the serial on it was 10126. And to a lot of people, that's not going to mean anything. Yes, it is an early production 1911, which is an interesting detail, but most soldiers especially aren't going to care about that. But 10126, Dan was in the 101st Airborne. He was in the 2nd Regiment of that division, so 501st, 502nd, 506. He was the 2nd Regiment, and then 6. He was in Fox Company at the 502nd, so he was the 6th company of that regiment. So that 1911 was almost fated to belong to somebody in the 2nd Battalion of the 502nd. And Dan was so pleased to have that weapon as a part of his own personal arsenal. And so Dan, he took that firearm and he carried that 1911 all the way through the war. He originally got a hip holster for it. That's what he was carrying in Normandy. But then after they got back into England, he got a shoulder holster for it, and he actually put that on underneath his 43 jacket, and he carried that all the way through the end of the war because he didn't want any Germans or any American officers or anybody like that to see him with a 1911 and make him turn it in. So he always kept it hidden on his person. And he would take that on patrols, he'd take it everywhere. So as it came down to the end of the war, Dan was trying to figure out how he could get his 1911 home because they weren't allowed to bring home firearms. They had to smuggle it back in some way, shape, or form. And so Dan got the genius idea. He took his canteen and he cut it down widthwise and disassembled the 1911. He took the slide off the frame and he wrapped it in a sock and then shoved it inside this canteen, put the canteen back together, and then he put it inside of his canteen carrier and just wore it on his belt, and it looked and felt just like a full canteen, and so nobody said anything about it. And so sure enough, he brought that home to Michigan. In the years since World War II, Dan McBride always had his 1911. He would shoot it almost every week. He actually put so many rounds through it that I believe it was sometime in the 90s or the early 2000s, he had actually cracked the slide on the 1911. And so he had to replace the slide and so forth. But in the latter years of his life, he replaced the original slide onto it. So it was a completely all original gun with the exception of the rear sight. He had switched that out. But it was always a very special artifact that every time I saw Dan, I would always ask to see his 1911 and have him tell me the story again and so forth. And so it was always a very unique thing that I had the opportunity to talk with Dan about. And then in the last few years of Dan's life, he sent the 1911 to Mark Bando to make it a part of his collection. And then just a couple months before Dan had passed away, he had asked Mark to pass that 1911 onto one of Dan's relatives. So it's back with the McBride family now. Every time I hold a 1911 now, I always think of Dan McBride, and I always see that serial number on any 1911 that I pick up. Full disclosure, this 1911 that I've been using in this video is not Dan's original 1911. I would love to have that firearm, but this is one that's exactly like it. It is a 1911, not a 1911A1. This one is a little bit of a later serial number. So it's not quite as old as Dan's, but Dan's had the diamond grips, had the flat spring housing against the back, and then had the extended World War I trigger on it. So February 16th, 2022 had come around. I had just seen Dan about 4 months prior. On November 8th, I had driven down to Silver City, New Mexico, and I spent about 7 or 8 hours with him. And I brought a bunch of original photographs as well as a bunch of World War II equipment. And we actually went through and talked about what equipment he carried with him throughout the different stages of the war. So he was very much at the forefront of my mind. But February 16th, 2022 came around. And I told you that date had significance for me in kind of 2 different areas. And the first of which is that was the day that I actually quit my full-time job. That was the day that Stand in the Door 1944 as a full-time job actually came to be a possibility. So I had made that step. I had given my notice, and I had called up a buddy of mine and asked him to go out to dinner with me so I could kind of process what was kind of going on and so forth. And while I was at that dinner, I got a text message from Mark Bando, and Mark had asked me, did you hear about Dan? I told him no, and he replied back. He's like, oh, well, I want you to be one of the first people to know that Dan passed away about 2 hours ago. And I was shocked. And being a member of the WWII Airborne Demonstration Team, we've befriended so many vets over the years. So many vets were so excited to come and be a part of that organization, to spend time with us and the new students and pinning on wings and telling us their stories, that a lot of us had gotten really close to a lot of those vets. But Dan McBride was the one that I had by far gotten the closest to. And so whenever he passed away, it was really heavy on me. A few weeks later, I was able to go down and actually be at Dan McBride's funeral, and I was given the honor to actually speak for a little while at his funeral and share a couple of my personal stories with him. And it was difficult. Over the years at the World War II Airborne Demonstration Team, we've had to say goodbye to a lot of vets as they've gotten into their 80s and 90s, and even beyond that, getting into their early hundreds, that a lot of those guys were passing away in very quick succession. And so it was very difficult for me and all the other members of the ADT. So I wanted to thank you for taking the time today to listen to at least a portion of Dan's story. And I want to ask that you pass this story on, whether you be forwarding the video or whether you be passing on the story yourself personally to other guys in your reenactment unit, to your friends and family, or maybe to the general public at some type of living history event. I ask that you pass on the stories of all World War II veterans, because it's what we do in World War II reenacting and living history that keeps their memories alive and that honors them the best way that we can. Thank you so much, and we'll see you next time.